You see a man like James Carter, you think you know his story. You see the dust caked into the lines on his face, the hollows under his cheekbones, the way his eyes are always scanning the horizon, like he's expecting trouble to ride right over it. You figure him for a broke rancher, maybe a drifter who lost his way, and you'd be right, but you'd also be dead wrong. Because James Carter wasn't just running from hunger, he was running from a ghost. A ghost with a name, a badge, and a price on its head. His own. The town he rode into wasn't a town at all. It was a scar, a handful of sun-bleached shacks clinging to the Wyoming dirt, like a dying man's last breath. The only building that looked like it still had any life in it was a two-story boarding house. Its porch light a lonely yellow eye in the coming dusk. And standing in that light was a woman. Her name was Emily Stone, and the sight of her hit James like a physical blow. Her dress was just thin muslin, patched and worn, but it clung to the curve of her hips and the swell of her chest in a way that made the air feel thin. Her auburn hair was a wild mess, catching the last red light of the sunset. And her eyes. Her eyes were green, and they held a promise that could make a saint forget his prayers. She moved toward him, a slow, deliberate sway that felt like a challenge. James felt his blood heat up, his hand tightening on the reins of his tired horse. He'd been on the trail for weeks, running on nothing but stale biscuits and bitter coffee. The hunger in his belly was a dull ache, but the hunger that clawed at him now was something else entirely, something sharp and dangerous. He tipped his hat, trying to hide the fire in his gaze. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rasp, "just looking for a room for the night." Emily's smile was slow and knowing. "Shelter's rare out here, stranger," she whispered, her voice like warm honey. Her scent, a mix of sage and something uniquely female, drifted over him, making his head swim. He was about to answer, to say anything to keep her talking, but he never got the chance, because that's when the first gunshot split the evening air. A bullet whizzed past his head, so close he felt the heat of it, and splintered the porch post right behind Emily. He didn't even think. He launched himself off his horse, tackling her to the ground, his body covering hers as more shots rang out. Shadows on the ridge. Riders, their faces hidden by the dying light. This wasn't a random robbery. This was an execution, and the bullets weren't aimed at him. They were all aimed at her. The attack was as sudden as it was brutal. James shielded Emily with his body, the hard-packed dirt cold against his cheek. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his chest. Bullets chewed up the ground around them, thudding into the walls of the boarding house. "Inside! Now!" a new voice yelled. James looked up. Another woman stood in the doorway, a shotgun held with the kind of familiarity that sent a shiver down his spine. She wasn't built like Emily. Where Emily was all soft curves, this woman was sharp angles and coiled strength. Her hair was the same auburn, but pulled back tight. Her eyes were steel gray, and they were blazing. This was Sarah Brooks. James scrambled to his feet, pulling Emily with him. They dove through the doorway as Sarah laid down cover fire, the shotgun booming in the small space, its roar a physical force. The attackers, surprised by the resistance, fell back for a moment, melting into the shadows. Sarah slammed the heavy oak door shut and dropped the bar into place. "You all right?" she asked, her gaze flicking from Emily to James, sharp and assessing. She wasn't asking about their health. She was asking if they were a liability. "We're fine," Emily breathed, her hand still clutching James's arm. Her touch was electric. James pulled away, trying to get his bearings. The inside of the house smelled of stew and wood smoke, a scent of home that felt alien to him. "Who were they?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah gave him a long, hard look. "The kind of trouble you don't want, stranger." She reloaded the shotgun with practiced, efficient movements. "They want this house." "Just the house?" James pressed. It didn't feel right. The attack was too personal, too focused. They were trying to kill Emily, he was sure of it. A small noise from the hallway made them all freeze. A little boy, no older than 7, peeked around the corner, his eyes wide with fear. A little girl stood half hidden behind him. "Is he staying, Ma?" The boy, Tommy, whispered. Emily rushed to them, gathering them in her arms. "It's all right, babies. Everything's all right." Sarah's expression softened for just a second as she looked at the children. Then her eyes hardened again as she turned back to James. "The offer's simple," she said, her voice dropping. "We need a man, someone to look like the head of this family, to make the wolves think twice before they come sniffing around." She gestured around the room. "You get a bed, 3 meals a day. In return, you stand with us. You stand on that porch, and you make it clear this property is protected." It was a crazy proposal, a desperate one. But as James looked at Emily, her green eyes pleading, and at Sarah, her jaw set with defiance, he understood. This wasn't just about property. This was about survival. He'd lost everything he ever cared about once before. His ranch, his wife, his life. All of it turned to dust and ash. He'd sworn he'd never get tied down again. Never have anything to lose. But as he looked at those two women and the children hiding behind them, something inside him shifted. A piece of the man he used to be, the man who stood for something, stirred from its long sleep. Before he could answer, a heavy fist pounded on the door. "Brooks, we know you're in there." A voice boomed from outside. "The mayor just wants to talk." Sarah's lips twisted into a sneer. "The mayor can talk to the end of my shotgun." But James stepped forward. He looked at Sarah, then at Emily. He was tired of running. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of a fight that mattered. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice steady. He walked to the door, his mind racing. This wasn't just a gang of thugs. This involved the law. The whole town was rotten. He unbarred the door and opened it just a crack. Mayor Hutchkins stood on the porch, flanked by two men who were definitely not deputies. They had the cold, dead eyes of hired guns. The sheriff, a man named Coleman with a face like a dried-up creek bed, stood a few paces behind, looking uncomfortable. "Evening, Mayor," James said, keeping his body in the doorway. Hutchins's eyes narrowed, taking in James from head to toe. He was a big man running to fat, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't know you," Hutchins said. "You new in town?" "Just passing through," James lied. "Happened to be here when your boys started shooting up the place. Not a very friendly welcome." The mayor's fake smile widened. "A misunderstanding. My men thought they saw squatters. This property belongs to the town now. A matter of unpaid taxes." Sarah pushed past James, her eyes spitting fire. "That's a lie, and you know it, Hutchins. We're paid up." "My records say otherwise," the mayor said smoothly, "but I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to overlook this little incident, provided you and your family are gone by sunrise." His eyes flicked to James. "All of you." The threat was clear. James felt that old instinct kick in, the one that told him when a man was lying, when the stakes were higher than they appeared. This wasn't about taxes. This wasn't even about the land itself. There was something else going on, something hidden. "This is my family now," James said, his voice low and hard as granite. He let his hand drift down, as if to rest on the butt of a pistol he didn't have. It was a bluff, but it was all he had. "And we're not going anywhere. You deal with me." Mayor Hutchins's smile finally vanished. For a second, James saw the snake underneath, a flash of pure, cold malice. Then it was gone. "Have it your way," Hutchins said, turning to leave. "But this land has a way of swallowing up men who don't know their place." As they walked away, the sheriff glanced back. He caught James's eye for a split second, and in that moment, James saw something flicker in the lawman's face. It wasn't malice. It was fear. The sheriff was afraid of the mayor, and that told James everything he needed to know. The law wasn't coming to help them. They were utterly, completely alone. The silence that fell after the mayor left was heavier than the darkness outside. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. James bolted the door, his mind working furiously. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He'd made a choice. He'd drawn a line in the sand. Emily came to him, her hand resting on his arm. Her touch was gentle, but he could feel her trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he said grimly. "He'll be back, and he won't be knocking next time." Sarah was already moving, checking the windows, her shotgun never leaving her side. "He's right. We need to get ready." There was a strange energy between the three of them, an unspoken understanding. They were strangers, bound together by a sudden, violent twist of fate. Later that night, after the children were asleep, James sat at the kitchen table, cleaning the old rifle they'd given him. It was a Winchester, well-oiled and cared for. These women were prepared. Emily brought him a cup of coffee. She sat across from him, the lantern light playing in her auburn hair, making it look like fire. "Why here?" James asked, his voice quiet. "Why this house? What does Hutchkins really want?" Emily looked down at her hands. "Our husbands, they built this place. They bought the land from the government. It's all we have." "That's not what I'm asking," James said, his gaze steady. "Men like Hutchkins don't go to this kind of trouble for a dusty patch of land unless there's something on it, or under it." A flicker of something, fear, maybe something else, crossed her face before she could hide it. I I don't know what you mean." But she was lying. He could see it in her eyes. It was a small thing, a slight hesitation, but to a man who'd spent years learning to read people, it was as loud as a scream. He didn't push. Not yet. He stood up, the rifle feeling solid and familiar in his hands. "I'm going to take a look around outside. See what we're up against." Sarah met him at the door. "Don't be a fool. They could still be out there." "They're not," James said. "Not yet. Hutchkins will want to make us sweat. He'll be back tomorrow night with more men. He wants to make an example of us." He slipped out into the darkness, moving like a wraith. The skills he'd tried so hard to bury were coming back to him, as natural as breathing. He circled the property, his eyes scanning the landscape. The boarding house sat on a small rise, giving it a good defensive position, but there was something odd about the land behind it. A section of the property, maybe an acre, was fenced off with unusually sturdy posts. Not for cattle. This was a fence meant to keep people out. Or in. He found a small weathered shed near the back of the fenced-off area. The lock was old and rusted, but heavy-duty. He picked it easily with a piece of wire from a broken fence. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of dust and something else. Something metallic. He struck a match. It wasn't a tool shed. The walls were lined with shelves, but they weren't holding tools. They were holding crates. Dozens of them, all identical, all unmarked. He pried one open with his knife. It wasn't gold, it wasn't guns. It was packed with medical supplies, bandages, surgical tools, bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid. More supplies than a town 10 times this size would ever need. And underneath that layer, he found something else. Bundles of cash, new bills wrapped in paper bands from a bank in Cheyenne, and a ledger. He opened the leather-bound book. The match flickered, about to die. He lit another one. The pages were filled with neat coded entries, dates, names he didn't recognize, and sums of money. It looked like a record of payments. But then he saw a name he did recognize. Mayor Hutchkins, and next to his name, a series of dates and figures. But they weren't payments received. They were listed under a different heading. Extortion. This wasn't a boarding house. He slammed the ledger shut, his heart pounding. The match burned his fingers, and he dropped it, plunging the shed into darkness. This was a safe house, a clinic, a way station for people on the run. And the women weren't just renting rooms. They were running an operation. And Hutchkins wasn't trying to take their land. He was trying to take their business. James slipped out of the shed and back to the house, his mind reeling. The whole story was a lie. Emily and Sarah weren't just helpless widows fighting for their home. They were something else entirely, something far more dangerous. He entered the house silently. The main room was dark, except for the dying embers in the fireplace. But he wasn't alone. Sarah was waiting for him, sitting in a chair in the shadows. The shotgun was laid across her lap. "You found it, didn't you?" she said, her voice soft, but with an edge of steel. It wasn't a question. James didn't answer right away. He walked to the fireplace, his face illuminated by the faint orange glow. "You should have told me," he said. "We didn't know if we could trust you," Sarah said, standing up. She moved with a liquid grace that spoke of years of training. This was not a simple homesteader. "For all we knew, you were one of his." "One of whose?" "You saw the ledger," she said. "Hutchkins isn't the top of the food chain. He's just a dog on a leash. He works for a syndicate. They run everything in this territory. Smuggling, extortion, You name it. They're called the Red Hand. The name hit James like a punch to the gut. The Red Hand. The same syndicate he'd been tracking before his life fell apart. The same syndicate that had framed him, put a price on his head, and forced him into this life on the run. It wasn't a coincidence. Fate hadn't brought him to this door. His past had. Our husbands, they used to work for the Red Hand, Sarah continued, her voice low and bitter. They were enforcers, but they wanted out. They saw too much, learned too much. So they took something with them when they left. Insurance. The ledger, James breathed. She nodded. It has names, dates, all the proof needed to bring the whole organization down. The Red Hand found them before they could get it to the marshals. They killed them, but they never found the book. And you and Emily took over, James said, connecting the dots. You started helping people who were running from the hand, using their own money against them. It was the only way to survive, Sarah said, her eyes flashing. The only way to keep the children safe. The children, Tommy and Clara. It all clicked into place. They're not yours, are they? A shadow of pain crossed Sarah's face. No, they belong to a man named Elias Vance. He was the Hand's chief accountant. He's the one who put the ledger together. He was on his way to testify in Cheyenne, but his train was ambushed. We got the children, but we don't know if he made it out alive. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a house. It was the key to destroying the most powerful criminal organization in the West, and these two children were the only living witnesses who could corroborate the ledger. Hutchkins didn't just want the book. He wanted to silence the children. Permanently. Why tell me now? James asked, his voice hoarse. Because you're not who you say you are either, are you, James Carter? Sarah said, her gaze pinning him. I saw the way you moved during the attack. The way you sized up the mayor. That's not a down-on-his-luck rancher. That's a man who knows how to fight. A man who's been in the thick of it before. He had to make a choice. Tell them the truth and risk them throwing him out. Or keep his secret and fight this alone. He looked at Sarah, at her defiant stance, the shotgun held like an extension of her own arm. He thought of Emily, her quiet strength, and the two innocent children sleeping upstairs. They were all running from the same monster. My name isn't James Carter, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so long. It's James Callahan, and I was a U.S. Marshal, the lead investigator on the Red Hand case. Sarah's eyes widened, just for a second. I was there the night Elias Vance's train was hit, James continued, the memory coming back, sharp and painful. It was a setup. My own men sold me out. They killed my partner, framed me for it, and reported me dead. I've been running ever since. The room was silent for a long moment. The truth hung between them, raw and dangerous. They weren't just strangers thrown together by chance. They were two sides of the same coin, two ghosts haunted by the same enemy. So the Red Hand isn't just hunting the ledger and the children, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. They're hunting you too. They think I'm dead, James said, and I need to keep it that way. A floorboard creaked above them. They both looked up. Emily stood at the top of the stairs, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. She had heard everything. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Emily slowly descended the stairs, her eyes fixed on James. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, unsettling calm. So the drifter we took in, she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of their new reality, is the one man who could either save us all or get us all killed. I didn't ask for this, James said, his voice raw. None of us did. But it's here, Sarah cut in, her tone sharp and practical. She racked the shotgun, the sound echoing in the stillness. Hutchkins is coming back. We know that. And he'll bring the whole damn cavalry of the Red Hand with him this time. They won't stop until they have the ledger and the children. And you, Emily added, her green eyes boring into James. If they find out you're alive... She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what it meant. A bloodbath. James ran a hand over his tired face. For the first time in months, he wasn't just thinking about his own survival. He was trapped, tied to the fate of these women and children by a past he couldn't outrun. "We fight," James said, the decision settling in his bones. It wasn't a choice. Not really. It was the only path forward that wasn't paved with graves. But we don't fight fair. We use this house. We turn it into a fortress. The rest of the night and all through the next day, they worked. A strange energy propelled them, a mix of fear and grim determination. James's training took over. The part of him that was Marshall Callahan, the strategist, the survivor, came roaring back to life. He showed Sarah and Emily how to set up choke points, how to use the angles of the rooms for cover. They boarded up the downstairs windows, leaving only small slits to fire through. They brought in the other boarders, three grizzled old prospectors who had been living in the house for months. When Sarah told them the truth, that the house was a refuge, they didn't flinch. They'd all had their own run-ins with the Red Hands brand of justice. Their loyalty was absolute. James laid out a plan. They would rig tripwires in the yard, connected to barrels of oil from the shed. They would create a kill zone. As he worked alongside the women, he saw them in a new light. Sarah was a natural warrior, her movements precise and efficient. She knew her way around a firearm better than most men he'd served with. Emily, on the other hand, was the rock. She moved with a quiet grace, calming the children, organizing their meager supplies, her presence a steadying force in the swirling chaos. The unspoken tension between James and the two women was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, a shared glance with Emily that lasted a second too long, a moment when his hand brushed Sarah's as they worked on a barricade, sending a jolt through both of them. But it was different now. It was overshadowed by the looming threat, tempered by the shared danger. It was the bond of soldiers on the eve of battle. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of blood, orange, and purple, a sense of dread fell over the house. The quiet was worse than the noise. The waiting was a form of torture. James stood watch at an upstairs window, his rifle resting on the sill. He watched the horizon, waiting for the first sign of dust, the first glint of torchlight. Suddenly a rider appeared, a single rider coming fast, not from the direction of the town, but from the west. James's heart leaped into his throat. A scout? An advance man? The rider got closer, and James's blood ran cold. He recognized him. It was Ben Travis, his former partner, the man who had been standing next to him when their world exploded, the man he'd seen go down in a hail of bullets, the man he'd thought was dead for over a year. Ben pulled his horse to a stop in the yard, his eyes scanning the fortified house. He looked older, a long scar tracing its way down his left cheek, but it was him. "Jimmy?" Ben called out, his voice hoarse. "Jimmy Callahan, is that you in there? I heard whispers. I couldn't believe it." James's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He turned from the window, his face pale. Sarah was standing right behind him, her shotgun raised. "Who is he?" she demanded, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "My partner," James whispered, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "I thought he was dead." He raced downstairs and threw open the door, ignoring Sarah's hiss of protest. Ben was already off his horse, a wide, incredulous grin spreading across his face. "By God, it is you!" Ben laughed, striding forward and pulling James into a rough embrace. "They told me you were dead. I've been hunting the bastards who set us up ever since." Relief washed over James, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He wasn't alone. He had his partner back. "Ben, how?" "A rancher's wife found me, patched me up. Took me a year to get back on my feet. I've been following the Red Hands trail, looking for payback. I heard rumors of a fortified boarding house, a thorn in Hutchkins' side. I never dreamed it would be you holding the fort. It was a miracle, a 1 in a million chance." But as Ben stepped inside and his eyes fell on Emily, then on Sarah, and the shotgun she still held at the ready, his smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in his eyes. And in that moment, Marshal James Callahan saw it. The flicker of calculation, the practiced mask of a liar. This wasn't a reunion. Ben hadn't been hunting the Red Hand for payback. He'd been hunting for him, and he hadn't just found him by chance. He had been led here. The joyful reunion turned to ice in James's veins. He kept a neutral expression, but his mind was screaming. Every instinct he had, honed by years of chasing down liars and killers, told him something was terribly wrong. Ben Travis was the last person he trusted in the world, and now he might be the deadliest man he had ever faced. "Well now," Ben said, his smile returning, a little too wide this time. He looked around the fortified room. "Looks like you found yourself in a bit of a hornet's nest, Jimmy." "You could say that," James replied, his voice level, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. He introduced Sarah and Emily, watching Ben's every move, every glance. Ben was smooth. He tipped his hat to the ladies, offered a charming, apologetic smile for his sudden arrival. He told a convincing story of his survival and his quest for vengeance. He was the perfect picture of a loyal partner, risen from the grave. But James saw the lies. He saw the way Ben's eyes weren't just looking, they were assessing, cataloging the defenses, counting the number of fighters, noting the placement of the windows. He wasn't seeing a refuge to be defended. He was seeing a fortress to be breached. "It's a good thing I found you when I did," Ben said, clapping a hand on James's shoulder. The gesture felt wrong, possessive. "Hutchkins has a war party coming. At least 20 men. They're planning to hit you at moonrise. But with the two of us, we can give 'em hell." It was the perfect setup, the loyal friend arriving just in the nick of time. He would fight alongside them, earn their trust, and then, at the critical moment, he would turn. He would open the gate from the inside. James had to play along. To show any suspicion would be a death sentence. "Just like old times," James said, forcing a smile. He brought Ben a drink, and as they talked, he laid a trap of his own. He spoke of their plan, but he changed a key detail. He mentioned a hidden tunnel in the basement, a last resort escape route that led out to the old shed. There was no tunnel. He watched Ben's eyes. When he mentioned the non-existent tunnel, Ben's gaze flickered towards the floorboards for a split second. A predator noting an escape route he would need to cut off. James had his confirmation. Ben had betrayed him. He had likely been a part of the original setup, the ambush on the train. His survival wasn't a miracle. It was a lie to cover his treachery. He wasn't here to help. He was here to finish the job. He was here for the bounty on James's head and for the ledger. The next few hours were the most tense of James's life. He worked with Ben, side by side, preparing for the attack. They were a well-oiled machine, their old partnership falling back into a familiar rhythm, but underneath it all was a deadly current of deceit. Every shared word, every nod, was a lie. James had to get a message to Sarah without Ben noticing. He found his chance when he sent Ben to the roof to act as a lookout. He found Sarah in the kitchen where she was helping Emily secure the children in a hidden cellar beneath the pantry. He wrote a quick note on a scrap of paper. "Ben is a traitor. The tunnel is a lie. Watch my signal." He pressed it into her hand when Emily's back was turned. Sarah's eyes widened as she read it. She looked at him, 1,000 questions in her gaze. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. Her expression hardened into one of cold fury. She slipped the note into her pocket and nodded back. The plan was now in motion. As the moon began to rise, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard, the attack began. It was a full frontal assault. Torchlight flickered in the distance as 20 men, maybe more, advanced on the house. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Wood splintered, glass shattered. The roar of rifles and shotguns was deafening. James and Ben fought from the front windows, shoulder to shoulder. "Just like the old day," Ben yelled over the din, firing his repeater into the advancing line of attackers. "Just like 'em," James yelled back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The battle raged. The tripwires worked, igniting barrels of oil and turning a section of the yard into a wall of flame, scattering the attackers. The old prospectors fired with grim efficiency from the side windows. Sarah was a whirlwind of motion, moving between the windows, reloading, firing her shotgun with devastating effect. Emily stayed with the children, but her hands were steady as she passed ammunition up through a slot in the cellar door. The attackers were taking heavy losses, but they kept coming, driven by the orders of a man who stood back in the shadows, Mayor Hutchkins. Then came the moment James was waiting for. "They're trying to flank us on the west side," Ben shouted. "I'll head to the back rooms and keep 'em pinned down." "Go!" James yelled. This was it. Ben wasn't going to the west side. He was going to the back door, the one James had intentionally left with a weaker bar. He was going to let the enemy in. James gave the signal to Sarah, a quick, sharp whistle. She saw it. She broke off from the main firefight and disappeared toward the back of the house, moving like a shadow. James kept firing from the front, counting the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. He heard a crash from the rear of the house, the back door. Then he heard Ben's voice yell, "They're in! They're in the house!" A new wave of attackers, emboldened, surged towards the front porch. But James wasn't looking at them. He was listening for the sound he was expecting. It came a moment later, not a gunshot, but a heavy, sickening thud, and a man's grunt of pain and surprise. Then silence from the back of the house. James allowed himself a grim smile. Ben had walked right into the trap. He thought he was flanking them, but Sarah was waiting for him. She hadn't used her shotgun. The noise would have given it away. She'd used the heavy iron skillet from the stove. The tide of the battle began to turn. The attackers who had breached the back door were met not by a welcoming traitor, but by Sarah and the prospectors, who cut them down in a brutal crossfire in the narrow hallway. Seeing their surprise attack fail, the men at the front wavered. James pressed the advantage, his rifle barking, picking them off one by one. Their assault faltered, then broke. They dragged their wounded and retreated back into the darkness, leaving a dozen of their own lying in the dirt. The silence that descended was sudden and complete, broken only by the crackle of the burning oil and the ragged breathing of the defenders. They had held. They had won the battle. But the war wasn't over. James raced to the back of the house. Sarah stood over Ben Travis's unconscious form, the skillet still in her hand. "He was just as you said," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "He unlocked the door." "Tie him up," James ordered. "When he wakes up, he's going to tell us everything." They dragged Ben to the cellar and bound him tightly to a support beam. As the adrenaline from the fight began to fade, a heavy exhaustion settled over them. The house was a wreck. The smell of gunpowder thick in the air. But they were alive. Emily emerged from the hidden room with the children, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She looked at James, and in her gaze he saw a new depth of respect and trust. They waited. An hour later, a groan came from the cellar. Ben Travis was awake. James went down alone, a lantern in his hand. Ben's face was a mess of bruises, his eyes burning with a mixture of pain and pure hatred. "You knew," Ben rasped. "I knew," James confirmed, his voice cold. "When did they turn you, Ben? Was it before the ambush or after?" Ben spat on the floor. "They didn't turn me. I was always with them. The Red Hand offers a future. You with your tin star and your rules, you were offering a quick grave. So you killed our friends. You set me up to die." "It was just business," Ben sneered, "and it still is. Hutchkins has a new plan. He knows he can't take this house by force. Not with you in it." James leaned in close, the lantern light casting demonic shadows on Ben's face. "What plan?" Ben laughed, a low, ugly sound. "He's not going to attack the house. He's going to burn the whole damn town to the ground. And he's going to tell everyone it was you. The crazed drifter holed up with those widows. He'll turn everyone against you. The sheriff, the ranchers, everyone. They'll form a posse and they'll come for you. They'll do the hand's dirty work for them." James's blood ran cold. It was a brilliant, diabolical plan. They had survived the siege, but they couldn't survive a war against the entire county. They would be branded as outlaws, murderers. There would be nowhere left to run. "And when does this happen?" James asked, his voice tight. Ben's smile was triumphant. "Dawn. He's lighting the first fire at dawn." James checked his pocket watch. They had less than 3 hours. He stared at his former partner, the man he'd once called brother. There was no flicker of remorse in his eyes, only the cold, hard certainty of a man who had sold his soul. James turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Ben in the darkness. He knew what he had to do. They couldn't win by defending. They had to attack. They had to take the fight to Hutchkins in the heart of his own town before he could rally the public against them. It was insane. It was suicide. It was their only chance. He gathered Sarah and Emily in the battered kitchen. The two old prospectors, their faces grim, joined them. Hutchkins is going to burn the town and blame us, James said, laying out the situation. We have until dawn to stop him. We can't fight the whole town, Sarah said, her voice strained. We don't have to, James replied, his eyes burning with a desperate fire. We're not going to fight. We're going to expose him. He slammed the Red Hand's ledger down on the table. This is our weapon, but it's no good if it stays here. We need to get it to someone who can use it. The sheriff? Emily asked. James shook his head. Coleman's too scared of Hutchkins. He'll bury it. No, we need to go over his head. He paused, his plan forming. The telegraph office. If we can get a message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne, if we can wire them the names and accounts in this book, we can bring the whole syndicate down before the first flame is lit. It was a long shot. The telegraph office was right in the center of town, likely guarded. But it was a plan, a sliver of hope in a sea of darkness. How do we get there? Sarah asked. The town will be crawling with his men. We don't go through the town, James said, a glint in his eye. We go under it. He remembered something from the old town plans he'd studied as a marshal. When this town was a mining camp, they dug a series of storm drains. Most are collapsed, but the main one runs right from the creek bed behind this house, all the way to the center of town. It comes out right behind the assay office, which is next door to the telegraph station. It was a desperate gamble. They had no idea if the drain was still passable, but they had to try. The decision was made. One of the prospectors, a wiry old man named Jeb, would stay with Emily and the children to defend the house as a last resort. Sarah, James, and the other prospector, a quiet hulk of a man named Gus, would make the journey through the drain. They gathered their weapons and supplies. James took one last look at Emily. The fear was there in her eyes, but beneath it was a bedrock of trust. In him. Come back, she whispered, her hand briefly touching his. I will, he promised. They slipped out the back of the house under the cover of darkness, making their way to the creek bed. They found the entrance to the drain, a dark, gaping maw hidden behind a curtain of overgrown weeds. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and decay. It was a tight squeeze, the stone walls slimy to the touch. They moved in single file, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. The only sound was the drip of water in their own ragged breaths. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint square of light ahead. A grate. James peered through. They were there, right behind the assay office. The street was quiet, but he could see two of Hutchkins's men guarding the front of the telegraph station. Gus, you create a diversion on the far end of the street. A fire, anything. Draw them away, James whispered. Sarah, you're with me. We go in fast and hard. They nodded. Gus slipped away into the darkness. A few minutes later, a shout went up from the other end of town, followed by the orange glow of flames. A small fire had started in a hay wagon. The two guards cursed and ran towards the commotion. It was their chance. James and Sarah burst out of the alley. James kicked open the door to the telegraph office. The operator, a skinny man with a green eye shade, looked up, his mouth falling open in terror. Don't make a sound, James hissed, leveling his pistol. I need you to send a message, a long one, and you need to do it now. He threw the ledger onto the desk, opened to the first page. Start sending everything to the U.S. Marshal's office, Cheyenne. Priority message from Marshal James Callahan. The operator's hands trembled as he started tapping the key. The frantic clicking filled the small room. Click, clack, click. Click, clack, click. It was the sound of their salvation or their death warrant. They had been transmitting for less than 5 minutes when the door burst open. It wasn't Hutchkins's thugs. It was Sheriff Coleman, his face pale, his pistol shaking in his hand. Carter, Callahan, whoever you are, it's over. Hutchkins knows you're here. Then you have a choice, Sheriff, James said, his voice calm, never taking his eyes off the telegraph operator. You can stand with him and go down with the red hand when the marshals get here. Or you can stand with the law. Your law. Coleman was paralyzed with fear and indecision. But then behind him, the large form of Mayor Hutchkins appeared in the doorway. He held a sawed-off shotgun, and the snake-like smile was back on his face. "Brave words, Marshal," Hutchkins sneered. "But you're too late. Your message isn't going anywhere." He raised the shotgun, but he wasn't aiming at James. He was aiming at Sheriff Coleman. "You've been a disappointment, Coleman," Hutchkins said, his voice dripping with contempt. Before he could pull the trigger, Sarah, who had been silent in the corner, moved. She threw a heavy inkwell from the desk, striking Hutchins's hand. The shotgun discharged, the blast tearing a hole in the ceiling. In that split second of chaos, James acted. He launched himself at Hutchins, tackling him through the doorway and into the dusty street. They wrestled for the shotgun, their bodies crashing against the wooden boardwalk. Hutchins was strong, his bulk giving him an advantage. He brought the butt of the gun down, catching James in the ribs. Pain exploded in his side, but he held on. Inside the office, Sheriff Coleman finally made his choice. He raised his pistol and pointed it at the two red-hand thugs who had followed Hutchins. "Drop your weapons. It's over," he yelled, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. Outside, James rolled, kicking Hutchins' legs out from under him. The shotgun skittered across the dirt. James scrambled for it, but Hutchins was faster. He pulled a derringer from his coat. A single shot rang out. James flinched, expecting the impact, but it never came. Mayor Hutchins stared down at his chest, a look of blank surprise on his face. A small dark hole had appeared in his white shirt. He looked up at James, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. Then he crumpled to the ground. James looked up. Sarah stood in the doorway of the telegraph office, James's rifle in her hands, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. Her aim had been true. It was over. The sun was just beginning to rise as 24 U.S. Marshals rode into town. The telegraph had worked. The message had gotten through. They found a town in chaos, a dead mayor, and a group of exhausted, battle-scarred heroes. The ledger did the rest. It brought the entire Red Hand Syndicate crashing down. Names were named. Arrests were made across the territory. The reign of terror was finally at an end. James Callahan got his name back, and his badge. They offered him a promotion, a desk in Cheyenne, a hero's welcome. He turned it all down. He stood on the porch of the boarding house, now scarred but still standing strong. The Wyoming wind felt different now, cleaner, freer. Emily and Sarah stood with him, the children playing in the yard. The unspoken tension between them had finally settled. It wasn't the fleeting heat of desire anymore. It was something deeper, stronger. The quiet, unshakable bond of family. A family forged in fire and blood. "So what's next for the famous Marshal Callahan?" Sarah asked, a small smile playing on her lips. James looked at her, then at Emily. He looked at the house, his home. He was no longer a ghost running from his past. He was a man who had found his place. "I'm retired," James said, his voice filled with a peace he hadn't felt in years. "I hear you might be in need of a man, someone to play the part of the family head." Emily's green eyes sparkled. "The position is open," she said softly, "but the part is for life." James Carter, the man carved hollow by loss, was finally full again. He had found his justice, not in a badge or a gun, but in the steadfast hearts of two incredible women and the home they had built together. If this story of a man who found his honor in a lawless land kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and absolutely destroy that like button. And for more tales where justice is hard-won and heroes are found in the most unexpected places, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.